Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
The Tale of Miss Kitty Cat by Arthur Scott Bailey, 1877 to 1949. Chapter 17. The Eavesdropper. For anyone feeling faint from hunger, Moses Mouse was quick to act. He dashed to the box of potatoes with surprising agility. His wife was already inside, munching away. "I'll have my supper first," he declared, "while you stay out here on the cellar floor and keep watch for Miss Snooper." "I'm just as hungry as you are," his wife protested. "I don't want to wait. You'll take forever to finish your supper." What she really meant was that Moses Mouse would undoubtedly overeat, as usual. "Fine," he replied with a shrug, "but don't blame me if Miss Snooper sneaks up on us." With that, Moses Mouse dug in with gusto. Although there were treats he preferred to raw potatoes, he was hungry enough to enjoy them, even without salt. His wife also ate with nearly as much enthusiasm. The pale moonlight streamed through the cellar window, casting eerie beams across their makeshift dining area. Despite the damp chill and musty smell, they found the setting oddly delightful. "This feels just like old times," Moses said between mouthfuls. Mrs. Mouse nodded in agreement. They were so caught up in their meal, they forgot all about keeping watch. It wasn't until Maud glanced up and spotted two glowing eyes peering over the edge of the box that reality struck. "Miss Snooper," he gasped, his mouth stuffed with potato. Without a second thought he bolted, hoping his wife would follow his lead, but he ran off without looking back. Moments later, Miss Kitty Cat pounced onto the box. Her paw shot out to grab what she thought was Mrs. Mouse, but to her dismay she clutched only a small potato. Letting out a frustrated yowl, Miss Kitty Cat dropped her prize. She quickly realised the mice had already escaped. In one corner of the box she spotted a tiny hole. "So that's how they got away," she growled. "How did I miss this hole earlier?" Though she had missed her midnight snack, Miss Kitty was too furious to feel disappointed. "So they've been calling me Miss Snooper behind my back," she hissed. "Now I know what old dog Spot wouldn't tell me." The next morning Miss Kitty ran into Spot in the woodshed, still fuming. "What are you doing here?" she snapped. "Just sniffing around for breakfast," Spot replied with a cheeky grin. "Snooping?" Miss Kitty spat, her eyes narrowing. "Watch what you say. I heard some mice talking last night." "Ah," said Spot calmly. "Eavesdropping, were you? Well, they say listeners never hear anything nice about themselves." Spot decided it was best to look for breakfast elsewhere. Miss Kitty's bad mood was nothing he wanted to deal with. Chapter 18. Kidnapped. The entire mouse family was overjoyed. Pudgy Mr. Moses Mouse had stumbled upon some news that thrilled him, his wife, and all their numerous relatives. Miss Snooper, as they always called Miss Kitty Cat, was gone. Someone had taken her away. Master Meadow Mouse had witnessed the whole event and shared every detail with Moses. He explained how a wagon had carried Miss Snooper up the road and over the hill. He'd watched it disappear with his own eyes. Moses repeated the story as quickly as his short breaths would allow. He had rushed home to spread the word as soon as he heard of it. But no one in the mouse family cared about how Miss Kitty Cat or Miss Snooper had left, or where she'd gone, who took her, or why. All that mattered was that she was gone. Everyone agreed it was the best news ever. Good riddance to bad rubbish, they declared, clearly delighted. If only it were true. At first the mouse family was too cautious to believe it. But when 2 days passed and Moses Mouse himself had ventured into the pantry, the kitchen and even the woodshed without encountering Miss Kitty, they finally decided she was gone for good. Meanwhile, Miss Kitty Cat was having a miserable time. She really had been taken away. A peddler driving his wagon up the hill one evening had spotted her lounging on a stone wall near the bend in the road, just past the farmhouse. "Kitty, Kitty, Kitty," the man called as he stopped his horse. Reaching behind the wagon seat, he pulled out a bit of food and held it out to her. As luck would have it, Miss Kitty Cat had been thinking about food at that very moment. She had been hoping a snack might appear from the cracks in the stone wall. When it was dangled right in front of her, she couldn't resist. She hopped into the wagon, and before she knew it, the peddler had popped her into a basket and fastened the lid. Miss Kitty Cat was now a prisoner. "There, my beauty," the peddler exclaimed. "I'll take you home. We need a good mouser, and I bet you're a skilled one. You were probably hunting chipmunks on the wall, weren't you?" Miss Kitty didn't reply. Of course she was flattered to be called a beauty, but she was far less pleased about everything else. The peddler had gotten to toss a scrap of meat into the basket, the bait he'd used to lure her. The air inside her makeshift prison was stuffy, and she had no idea where the man was taking her. The wagon jolted as the peddler urged his horse forward and started up the hill. Every time a wheel struck a rock, Miss Kitty clenched her teeth. She hated riding in wagons, and this one was particularly uncomfortable. "They'll wonder back home where I've gone," she thought, "and one thing's for sure, everyone will miss me." Chapter 19, Unfamiliar Place. The peddler who took Miss Kitty Cat away in his cart drove late into the night. Inside the basket where she was trapped, Miss Kitty kept her mind busy. She noticed every twist and turn as the wagon creaked up hills and rattled down the other side. On long, flat stretches, the peddler urged his horse into a brisk pace, quickly putting miles between them and Farmer Green's home in Pleasant Valley. "Oh dear," Miss Kitty thought, "it's going to be quite the journey getting back home." She was already planning her return. She didn't care if this stranger's house needed a good mouser, but she knew Farmer Green needed her just as much. If Mrs. Green has to rely on traps to deal with the mice, the house will be overrun in no time, Miss Kitty mused. That fat Moses Mouse will become bolder than ever the moment he realises I'm gone. Eventually the wagon left the main road and stopped in a yard. The dog barked and Miss Kitty heard voices. "I've brought you something you'll like," the peddler said as he handed over the basket, "but don't open it outside or it'll get away." Later, inside the house, a woman opened the basket and released Miss Kitty. "What a big cat," she exclaimed. "Where did you find her?" "Oh, I picked her up on the road," the peddler replied with a chuckle. "She looked like she wanted a ride. I think she was hunting along an old stone wall." "She'll have plenty of hunting to do here," the woman said. "This house is crawling with mice. I'll put her down in the cellar and let her earn her supper." Without ceremony, she tossed Miss Kitty down the cellar stairs and slammed the door shut. Miss Kitty was furious. "Is that any way to treat a guest?" she muttered in the dark. "At least she could have done was to offer me a little milk after that awful ride in that stuffy basket." Miss Kitty couldn't help thinking about the comfortable life she'd left behind. Mrs. Green had always been kind to her, and even Johnny Green, despite being a boy, petted her more often than he pulled her tail. But hunger soon distracted Miss Kitty from her thoughts. As she sat at the bottom of the stairs, she began to hear faint rustles, squeaks, and scratches around her. Despite her anger at the woman upstairs, Miss Kitty wasted no time catching herself a hearty meal. Afterwards, she curled up on an old sack and dozed off. Just before dawn, she spotted a broken pane in one of the cellar windows. "What luck," she whispered to herself. Silently, she slipped through the opening and disappeared into the night. Chapter 20, A Long Journey. By sunrise, Miss Kitty Cat had already covered at least a mile along the road that led away from the peddler's house. She wanted to put plenty of distance between herself and the family before they woke up and let out the dog that barked the night before when she arrived. She clearly remembered the wagon climbing a long hill before turning into the peddler's yard. Without a second thought, she headed downhill, certain that Pleasant Valley and her home at Farmer Green's lay in that direction. After completing the first mile of her journey, Miss Kitty stopped by a small brook and drank deeply of its cool, refreshing water. She was parched, having gone without a drink since the evening before. Beyond the brook lay a beautiful wooded area, and Miss Kitty couldn't resist exploring it. At that early hour, birds chirped in the trees and chipmunks darted about, foraging for their breakfast. Naturally, Miss Kitty's thoughts turned to her own empty stomach. "If I were home, Mrs. Green would be putting out a saucer of milk on the woodshed steps right about now," she mused. "But out here, I'll have to fend for myself." Fortunately, Miss Kitty was more than capable of finding a meal. as she soon discovered an unsuspecting meadow mouse. After enjoying her breakfast, Miss Kitty lingered in the woods, amusing herself by teasing the birds. They scolded her loudly, called her a tramp, and demanding that she leave. Of course, this only made her more determined to stay. She had no intention of being intimidated, and even pretended to climb a tree to reach their nests. Though she did nothing more than sharpen her claws on the bark, the sight of her sent the birds into a frenzy. Eventually, satisfied that she'd had her fun, Miss Kitty resumed her journey to Pleasant Valley. Sometimes she travelled through open fields, sometimes along the road, and occasionally she leapt onto a stone wall and used it as her bath. Whenever she heard the creak and rattle of a wagon approaching, she quickly hid in the bushes, waiting until the road was clear before continuing. If she hadn't been homesick, Miss Kitty might have enjoyed her adventure. But she couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Green's kitchen, with its tempting smells of 7-layer cakes baking in the oven and doughnuts sizzling on the stoves. The memory of her cosy spot under the kitchen range, where she loved to nap, made her heart ache and her pace quicken. How Miss Kitty found her way back to Farmer Green's house might have remained a mystery even to her, and even if she had known, she wouldn't have told. Miss Kitty was the kind to keep such things to herself. She didn't even share the details of her 3-day disappearance with old dog Spot when she returned. One afternoon, as she emerged from a patch of woods on a hilltop, something familiar appeared on the horizon. It was Blue Mountain, and she knew that Pleasant Valley and her home at Farmer Green's lay just beyond it. Chapter 21. In the Pantry. Everyone knows the saying, while the cat's away, the mice will play, so it came as no surprise that during Miss Kitty Cat's absence from the farmhouse, the mice made the most of their freedom. Every midnight Mrs. Green's pantry became the site of lovely feasts, and no one enjoyed them more than the rotund and cheerful Miss Moses Mouse. He was the life of the party, cracking jokes about Miss Snooper, his nickname for Miss Kitty Cat. His jokes always sent the room into fits of laughter, and none laughed louder than Moses himself. With each passing night, Moses grew bolder and even more mischievous. Some of the mice claimed they could hardly eat because they were laughing so hard at his antics. On the 4th night of Miss Kitty's absence, during yet another midnight feast, Moses decided to show off. Balancing a piece of cheese on the tip of his nose, he declared, "What a shame Miss Snooper isn't here. I'd love to offer her this delicious treat." To his surprise, none of his friends laughed. "Watch out, Moses," Mrs. Mouse suddenly squeaked. "Relax, my dear," he replied confidently. "I'm not going to drop it. I've practiced this trick plenty of times. It's too bad Miss Snooper isn't here to see it." But still, no one even chuckled. Moses thought their silence was odd. Fixing his eyes on the cheese, making himself slightly cross-eyed in the process, he glanced around the room for a moment. To his shock, all the other mice had disappeared. "Ha!" Moses said to himself. "They're playing a prank on me, hiding somewhere to get a laugh at my expense." Irritated, he gave a loud snort. Although Moses loved pulling tricks on others, he couldn't stand being the target of a joke himself. Unfortunately for him, that snort made the piece of cheese tumble off his nose and roll onto the pantry floor behind him. When he turned to retrieve it, he froze. Standing right there was Miss Snooper herself. Miss Kitty Cat had returned home. Before Moses could react, Miss Kitty slammed a paw down on him, pinning him to the ground. "Well, well," she said with a sly grin. "Aren't you happy to see me? You were just saying you wished I were here." Moses, however, didn't seem the least bit happy. He wriggled and squirmed with all his might, but Miss Kitty easily held him in place with one paw. "Now that I'm here," she continued, "don't you ever want to balance that piece of cheese on your nose again? You were going to offer it to me, weren't you?" Since the moment Miss Kitty caught him, Moses hadn't been able to form any coherent words. All he managed were a few terrified squeaks. Finally he gasped, "Yes, just let me go for a moment. I can't pick up the cheese while you're pressing me into the pantry floor." Chapter 22. The Flour Barrel. Miss Kitty Cat released Moses Mouse, but not before giving him a sharp nip to warn him not to try escaping. "Ouch!" Moses squeaked. Trembling with fear, he picked up the pieces of cheese he had dropped on the pantry floor. His paws shook so much that he couldn't balance the cheese on the tip of his nose. It fell off immediately. As he turned to retrieve it, Miss Kitty Cat moved into step with him. However, just as she turned, Moses quickly darted behind a flour barrel. Miss Kitty sprang after him, but the barrel was so close to the wall there was only a narrow gap behind it. Moses could slip through with ease, but Miss Kitty's paw couldn't reach him. Determined, Miss Kitty ran around the barrel, only to find that Moses had already crept back through the crack and was staring at her with his beady little eyes. Frustrated, she dashed round the barrel again, only for Moses to repeat the trick. While she had to scamper all the way round, Moses only needed to move the length of his tail. This isn't working, Miss Kitty thought as she peered through the crack, catching her breath. Then an idea struck her. It seemed so clever that she decided to act on it immediately. She darted off as if to run round the barrel again, but halfway around she doubled back, hoping to catch Moses off guard. To her shock, Moses wasn't there. In fact, he was nowhere to be seen. "Goodness me," Miss Kitty wailed. "Something must have gone wrong with my plan." Her idea had been fine. It was just that Moses had come up with one of his own. "I'm not spending all night avoiding this barrel," he decided. "Next time Miss Snooper comes around, I'm climbing to the top and trusting my luck." And that's exactly what he did. While Miss Kitty dashed in circles, Moses scampered up the side of the barrel. From there, he leapt to a shelf and made his way along it until he reached the pantry window. Luckily for him, Mrs. Green had left the window slightly open. Moses squeezed through, tumbling down to the ground outside. From there, he made a quick dash to his nest through a crack in the cellar wall. Meanwhile, Miss Kitty reluctantly accepted defeat. "Dear me," she sighed. "What terrible luck I've had tonight. What a sad homecoming this has turned out to be." As for Moses, he couldn't have been happier. Mrs. Mouse greeted him with an enthusiastic fuss, which of course was exactly what he loved. Chapter 23, A Secret. Miss Kitty Cat was acting very strangely. She wandered into the kitchen and lingered around Farmer Green's wife, meowing softly and looking up at her as if trying to say something important. "What's the matter, Kitty?" Mrs. Green asked. "Are you hungry?" But it quickly became clear Kitty wasn't hungry, as she refused everything Mrs. Green offered. "Well, you'll have to move along," Mrs. Green said, shooing her away gently. "I can't get anything done with you underfoot." Kitty trotted toward the door, but stopped just short of leaving. It was obvious she had no intention of going unless Mrs. Green followed her. She returned to tug lightly at Mrs. Green's apron with her claws before running back to the doorway, meowing insistently. It seemed as though Kitty couldn't have been clearer about wanting Mrs. Green to come with her, but Mrs. Green still didn't get the message. "Shoo," Mrs. Green said, slightly irritated. "I've got too much to do today. I suppose you've caught a mouse and you want to show it to me. Well, you'll have to bring it here. I don't have time to go chasing after you." Feeling a little hurt, Miss Kitty Cat sat down on the doorstep and stared back into the kitchen. Occasionally, she let out a plaintive meow, but Mrs. Green refused to pay her any attention. Goodness, Kitty thought, Mrs. Green is even busier than usual this morning. Old Spot, the farm dog, had been watching Kitty with curiosity. As she headed toward the barn, he sidled up to her, wagging his tail in a friendly manner. "If Mrs. Green won't come with you, I'll go," he offered. "Just lead the way." "You?" Kitty scoffed, looking at him with disdain. "You must be joking. There's no way I'd let you see what I want Mrs. Green to see." Spot bristled. "Ha! And how exactly do you plan to stop me from following you?" "Oh, I have my ways," Kitty said firmly, her eyes narrowing. Spot immediately recalled the time he'd cornered her in the barn, not long after she arrived on the farm. The scratches on his nose had taken weeks to heal. "Oh well," Spot muttered. "I was only kidding, you know. I have more important things to do anyway, like dealing with that pesky woodchuck in the pasture." With that, he trotted down the lane, doing his best to appear dignified and very busy. Miss Kitty watched him go and gave a satisfied nod. "Good riddance," she said. "The last thing I need is to deal with him while I'm handling something important." Chapter 24, 5 in a Basket. "Well, if you're not bothering me again," Farmer Green's wife exclaimed. Miss Kitty Cat had crept up behind her and brushed against her, politely meowing at the same time, asking if Mrs. Green would kindly turn around. Mrs. Green looked over her shoulder. "My goodness," she cried. So that's what you've been fussing about, is it? Miss Kitty Cat gently placed something on the floor at her feet. She seemed very pleased when Mrs. Green bent over and picked up a tiny, soft, pudgy kitten. What do you think of that? Miss Kitty Cat seemed to ask, or at least that's how Mrs. Green understood it. Anyway, Miss Kitty appeared delighted with Mrs. Green's reaction. Feeling that her kitten was in safe hands, Miss Kitty Cat ran out of the kitchen and disappeared. A little while later, she returned carrying another kitten in her mouth. Mrs. Green admired this one just as much as the first, and again Miss Kitty vanished. She returned with a third kitten, then a fourth. Well, well, Farmer Green's wife said, I think we have enough now, don't you? Mrs. Green soon discovered Miss Kitty Cat didn't quite agree. She made one more trip across the yard to the barn. With great pride she returned and placed the fifth kitten on the kitchen floor. That's all, Mrs. Green, Miss Kitty seemed to say. They're so beautiful, it's a shame there aren't twice as many. But Mrs. Green was outside in the woodshed and didn't hear her. She came in soon with the basket. This is what old Spot used to sleep in when he was a puppy, Mrs. Green told Miss Kitty Cat. I suppose you won't mind using it for your kittens. Miss Kitty had no objections when Mrs. Green carefully placed the 5 kittens on an old shawl in the bottom of the basket. Then, with Miss Kitty following closely, Mrs. Green took the basket to the woodshed and set it down in the corner. There, Mrs. Green said, now they're snug and warm, and I've set your milk right beside the basket, so you won't have to leave them when you drink it. It wasn't long before old dog Spot stuck his nose through the woodshed door and saw Miss Kitty Cat drinking her milk next to the basket. He barked loudly when he saw her. To his surprise, both Miss Kitty Cat and Farmer Green's wife came running at him. Mrs. Green was holding a broom, and Miss Kitty had her claws out. They both ordered him to stay away from the woodshed. Spot sneaked off to the barn and hid in the stall with the old horse, Ebenezer. What's the matter? Ebenezer asked slowly. It's that grumpy Miss Kitty Cat, Spot replied. She's got a big family of kittens, and so she's so touchy about anyone coming near them. Even though she's keeping them in my basket, she doesn't let me see them. I just hope they don't grow up to be like their mother. Ebenezer looked at him in surprise. What's wrong with Miss Kitty? He asked. She takes everything too seriously, said Spot. If you chase her, she'll always claw you if she can. Now, this was one of the first lessons Miss Kitty taught her kittens. She said claws were made to be used, especially on old dog Spot. But when a kitten used its claws on one of its siblings, Miss Kitty would quickly give it a smart cuff. She said claws weren't made for that, especially not on family members. And in time, the kittens learned those lessons perfectly.